This stare alone will creep you out, but what you're about to hear will absolutely outrage you, shake you to your core, and disgust you in ways you'll wish you never knew, just like we did. Especially once you learn how this coward killed dozens of people, only to somehow walk free again.
I feel threatened by the fact that he will kill again, for sure.
I was scared to death that he was going to get out on the street because nobody's going to know where he is until the bodies start turning up.
So how did a monster like this slip through the cracks for so long? When you research why serial killers target women, the usual answers come up: assault, power, and control, the urge to dominate, the thrill of sadistic pleasure, the twisted rush of violence that so many killers admit to. But this story is different. This predator didn't want physical contact. He didn't want control. He didn't even want money or revenge. Instead, he claimed he was haunted by something he called evil in women's eyes. And that was all he needed to justify killing them. It all began on November 7th, 1953, in the town of Killeen, Texas. The boy was named Carl Eugene Watts, born into a fractured home that would shape him in ways no one could have foreseen. When Carl was just shy of 2 years old, his parents' marriage came to a bitter end. His father, Richard Watts, was a private first class in the Army, a man of discipline and duty. His mother, Dorothy Mae Young, was a kindergarten art teacher, creative and patient, but overwhelmed by circumstance. After the divorce, Carl and his younger sister were swept into the care of their father in Inkster, Michigan, while their mother worked to regroup and rebuild her life. In those early years, Carl often stayed with his grandmother. She remembered him as a quiet boy with peculiar habits. Instead of playing with toys or other children, he showed a fascination for hunting and skinning rabbits, a dark pastime for a child who had barely reached grade school. It was also during this time that he picked up the nickname Coral, a southern mispronunciation his grandmother and cousins used so often that it stuck. By the time his mother remarried a mechanic named Norman Caesar, Carl's world had become even more complicated. Norman already had 6 children of his own, and when Dorothy and Norman added 2 more daughters to the household, Carl found himself pushed further into the shadows. In such a large family, he felt isolated, unwanted, and different. That loneliness would follow him into adolescence and twist into something far darker. As he hit his teenage years, Carl began to have fantasies of love and intercourse. But unlike other boys his age, his thoughts were not about first kisses or shy crushes. Instead, his imagination conjured gruesome images of torture and death. By the age of 12, Carl admitted he was fantasizing not about holding hands or going to school dances, but about killing girls and women, whether they were older than him or painfully young. It was not just a passing thought. It was an obsession that settled deep into his mind. At school, Carl was already marked as strange. Teachers and classmates noticed the odd way he stared at girls, the unsettling silence that seemed to follow him. His academic performance collapsed when, at 13, he was struck by meningitis, a severe infection attacking the membranes that protect the brain and spinal cord. The illness kept him bedridden, missing so many classes that he had to repeat the 8th grade. The long illness left behind more than scars. It was suspected to have caused lasting brain damage. Tests later revealed that Carl's reading ability never advanced beyond that of a 3rd grader. The struggle to keep up with his peers brought cruel bullying, leaving him introverted, angry, and alienated. By 16, he was quiet, withdrawn, and awkward, the kind of boy people instinctively avoided. To make a little money, Carl took up work as a paperboy, delivering newspapers through quiet neighborhoods. But even this mundane job would be overshadowed by violence. On June 29, 1969, while making his paper rounds, Carl knocked on the door of 26-year-old Joan G. When she opened the door, she had no idea she was inviting in a nightmare. Carl attacked her suddenly, striking her again and again. She screamed in terror, the cries echoing down the street, and only then did Carl stop. He walked away casually, continuing his paper route as though nothing had happened. It was a chilling glimpse of how easily he could blend violence into the ordinary. Police caught him quickly, but when questioned about why he had attacked an innocent woman, his answer was flat and terrifying. "I just felt like beating someone up." For this brutal act, Carl was institutionalized at the Lafayette Clinic, a psychiatric facility. There, doctors evaluated him and discovered his IQ measured at 68, placing him in the category of mild mental retardation by the terms of the day. Psychiatrists described him as impulsive, passive-aggressive, and dangerously drawn to violence. They noted that he struggled for control against powerful homicidal urges, and that he was prone to delusional thinking. Despite this, Carl was released later that year on November 7th, his 16th birthday. Back in school, Carl tried to pour his violent energy into sports. He joined the track team and the football squad, hoping physical exhaustion would quiet the storm inside his mind. It seemed to work for a while, and despite his academic struggles, Carl managed to graduate in 1973. His athletic ability even earned him a scholarship to Lane College in Tennessee, a fresh start he desperately needed. For a brief moment, it looked like he might finally build a different future. But fate had other plans. A serious leg injury ended his football career almost as soon as it began. Crushed and directionless, Carl dropped out and returned to his mother's home in Detroit. Within a year, he enrolled at Western Michigan University, but instead of focusing on studies, his dark habits reemerged. Reports circulated about female students being stalked and harassed both on and off campus. Rumors painted him as the shadow lurking in hallways and parking lots, watching, waiting. Carl's petty crimes escalated. He was caught stealing plywood from the university, a small offense but a sign of bigger things to come. Then, on October 30th, 1974, his violent fantasies erupted in a way that shocked investigators. Gloria Steele, a 20-year-old woman, answered a knock at her door from a man claiming to look for someone named Charles. Out of kindness, she let him inside. What happened next was pure horror. Gloria was tortured and stabbed 33 times. The brutality was beyond comprehension, and when her body was discovered, police were desperate to find her killer. Because of his prior record of violence and the bravery of women who identified him as suspicious, Carl was soon arrested. He confessed to attacking at least a dozen women, but coldly denied killing Gloria Steele, refusing to admit what investigators already suspected. To determine whether he could stand trial, Carl was sent to Kalamazoo State Hospital for psychiatric evaluation. The doctors who examined him reported something chilling. He lacked any trace of remorse. Diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, he was recognized as someone incapable of empathy, someone who saw people not as human beings, but as objects. During his stay in the psychiatric hospital, Carl Watts spiraled into a dark depression. The walls around him, meant to keep the world safe from his impulses, seemed instead to feed his brooding thoughts. He attempted self-harm by hanging himself with a cord, but even that failed. Doctors who observed him were unsettled. By 1975, the evaluation was clear. Carl was not only a danger to himself, but an undeniable threat to society. And yet, the justice system, limited by evidence and constrained by procedure, could not hold him for long. He was sentenced to only 1 year in prison. Astonishingly, he never stood trial for the brutal murder of Gloria Steele, the young woman stabbed more than 30 times in her home. Prosecutors lacked the ironclad evidence needed to convict him of her death. And so, in the summer of 1976, Carl Eugene Watts walked free, carrying with him his fantasies, his rage, and his growing appetite for blood. Shortly after his release, Carl tried to step into what society might call a normal life. He rekindled a relationship with an old friend, Dolores Howard, and together they had a daughter. For a moment, it looked as if he might settle into domestic life, but his violent urges did not care for fatherhood. The relationship with Dolores soured, and within months it collapsed. Soon after, he married a woman named Valeria Goodwill. Valeria would later reveal chilling details about her marriage to this man. She described him as plagued by violent nightmares, tormented by something she could never quite name. At home, he lived chaotically, slashing houseplants with knives, scattering clothing throughout the house, even piling garments on the garage floor as if marking his territory in disarray. To Valeria, he was not just messy, he was unstable, restless, dangerous. Though he wore the mask of a husband, Carl's demons were only growing stronger, waiting for the chance to erupt. And erupt they did. Over the next few years, reports of women being attacked and murdered began to dominate local headlines. In Detroit, the stories carried a dreadful familiarity. Women disappearing, women found brutally stabbed, women strangled in their own homes. One of the most shocking cases was that of Jean Clean, a 44-year-old Detroit news reporter. On Halloween night in 1979, Jean was stabbed 11 times with a screwdriver. The randomness of the weapon and the savagery of the attack spoke volumes. 6 months later, in the spring of 1980, another victim was found. 17-year-old Shirley Small was walking home when she was attacked and stabbed twice through the heart. The violence was precise, swift, and merciless. In July of that same year, Glenda Richmond, the respected manager of a local diner, was discovered outside her home. She had been stabbed 26 times, a level of overkill that screamed hatred but offered no motive. Not long after, in that same month, witnesses were horrified when they saw Lily Dunn kicking and screaming in her driveway. Neighbors could only watch as a car sped away with Lily trapped inside, her terrified cries fading into the night. By September 14, 1980, the violence reached new levels. Rebecca Huff, a 20-year-old woman, was found dead, having been stabbed more than 50 times. The sheer savagery of the attack shocked even veteran investigators. Then, in November of that year, the body of 63-year-old Lena Bennett was discovered hanging in her garage. Unlike the previous victims, she has been SA'd and choked to death. Each crime was gruesome, yet different. Some victims were stabbed, others strangled, still others drowned or hanged. The unpredictability made it nearly impossible to connect the murders into a single pattern. But locals, seeing the headlines, whispered what police already feared. Someone was hunting women in Michigan. As more bodies appeared, newspapers began to give the faceless killer a name. He was called the Sunday Morning Slasher, a predator who seemed to strike when the world was at its most peaceful. Quiet weekend mornings, when women walked alone, jogged through neighborhoods, or carried out simple routines. The nickname stuck, and with it came a sense of dread. No one felt safe. Police finally caught a break when officers on patrol spotted a suspicious vehicle circling Ann Arbor's Main Street at 5 o'clock in the morning. The driver, a man later confirmed to be Carl Watts, was following a woman closely. The woman, realizing she was being hunted, tried desperately to hide in a doorway. Officers observed Watts's frustration when he lost sight of her. One described him as looking like he had gone nuts in anger. It was a moment that revealed just how obsessive and volatile he was. Watts was arrested, though not for murder. The official charge was shockingly minor, driving with an expired license. Yet when police searched his vehicle, the evidence they uncovered sent chills through the department. Inside his car were screwdrivers, a wood filing tool, and, perhaps most disturbing of all, a dictionary that once belonged to murder victim Rebecca Huff. Scrawled across its pages were the words, "Rebecca is a lover." It was an eerie, incriminating link tying Watts to the crime. Still, Watts refused to speak. Interrogated for hours, he offered nothing, no confession, no details, only silence. With evidence that was disturbing but still circumstantial, police were left with no choice but to release him. It was an agonizing moment for investigators who knew they were looking into the eyes of a killer, but lacked the legal means to hold him. Among the detectives, one man refused to give up. Felony investigator Paul Bunton believed with absolute certainty that Carl Watts was the Sunday morning slasher. Bunton pushed for round-the-clock surveillance, and soon Watts realized he was being watched. The predator thrived on opportunity and stealth, and under constant police eyes, he could not kill freely. Feeling cornered, Watts made a move. In the spring of 1981, he left Michigan behind and relocated to Columbus, Texas. Michigan police, unwilling to let him slip away completely, sent his criminal records directly to Houston authorities, warning them of who was now in their city. Even with suspicions mounting, investigators struggled. Watts's killings had no single method. He stabbed, he strangled, he drowned, he bludgeoned. Unlike most serial killers, he rarely committed forcible intercourse. Without that hallmark, the cases seemed disconnected. The randomness of his methods shielded him, allowing him to appear almost invisible in the data-driven eyes of investigators. But time was running short. By May 23, 1982, Carl Watts could not resist his urges. In Houston, he attempted to break into the home of two women and drown them. They fought back, and by some stroke of fortune, they survived. This time, Watts was arrested. For investigators who had chased him for years, it was finally an opening. That August, a plea deal emerged that would stun the families of victims. Harris County Assistant District Attorney Ira Jones approached Watts with an offer. If Carl confessed to his crimes and revealed details about his victims, he would be granted immunity from murder charges. Instead, he would be charged with burglary with intent to murder. The logic was cold and practical. Prosecutors feared that without such a deal, they might never get him at all. Carl accepted. In the days that followed, he sat with officers and confessed. He admitted to attacking 19 women and murdering 13 of them. He led investigators to burial sites, showing them where 3 of his victims were hidden. He confessed to the stabbing of Jean Clean, the drowning of Linda Tilley in 1981, the stabbing of Elizabeth Montgomery, and the strangulation of Elena Amador. Then, in a moment that left investigators speechless, he claimed to have killed a total of 40 women. In other statements, he implied the number might be more than 80. He sometimes kept tokens from his victims, small items he would later burn. To him, this ritual of destroying their belongings was not about hiding evidence. It was about killing their spirit, erasing them completely. When asked about his motive, his answer never changed. Each woman, he said, had evil eyes. That was all it took. In court, Watts pled guilty to a single count of burglary with intent to kill, exactly as the bargain promised. He received a 60-year prison sentence. Just before he was led away, he gave one final warning to investigators. "You know, if they ever let me out, I'll kill again." It was not a threat. It was a promise. Once behind bars, Watts remained restless. He attempted to escape, but failed. He then turned to legal maneuvers, filing appeals to shorten his sentence. In 1989, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reviewed his case and discovered a technical oversight. The trial judge had failed to properly inform Watts that the bathtub water he had used in his attempted drowning of a woman named Lori Lister was legally considered a deadly weapon. Because of this error, Watts was not required to serve his full sentence. The shocking outcome meant that despite his dozens of killings, Carl Watts was eligible for release in May of 2006. If granted, he would have been one of the first serial killers in American history to be legally released back into society. The news horrified the families of his victims. By 2004, outrage boiled over. Mothers, fathers, siblings, and children of the women Carl had murdered raised their voices in protest. They wrote letters, marched outside courthouses, and begged judges and parole boards to see reason. The very thought that a man who openly admitted to killing women by the dozen could walk free again was not only unthinkable, it was cruel. For the survivors left behind, it felt as though the justice system was preparing to betray them a second time. Then came a breakthrough. A man named Joseph Foy, who had remained silent for years, could no longer keep what he had witnessed buried in his memory. He stepped forward with chilling testimony. He described what he had seen on a cold night in December of 1979. A woman named Helen Dutcher struggling to stay alive as she was stabbed over and over again in a dark alleyway. Foy had never forgotten that moment. The sight of her life draining away, the sound of her cries, the image of the man who struck without hesitation. His words breathed new life into the case, turning what had been a cold trail into a burning pursuit of long-delayed justice. Carl Watts was charged with Helen's murder, and this time, the jury delivered what so many families had prayed for. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But fate was not finished. Prosecutors revisited older cases, determined not to leave anything undone. Soon, Watts was found guilty in another case, the murder of Gloria Steele, the very one that had haunted investigators since 1974. The case that had slipped through the cracks decades earlier was now sealed with a verdict of guilty. For the first time, the system seemed to have closed its loopholes around him. Watts received another life sentence, this time without any possibility of parole. By September of 2007, it looked as though fate itself had finally intervened to keep Carl Watts caged for the rest of his days. Yet his story ended sooner than expected. In December of that same year, while locked inside a maximum security prison in Ionia, Michigan, Watts's health deteriorated rapidly. On December 21st, at the age of 53, he succumbed to prostate cancer in a Jackson, Michigan hospital. He left this world quietly, nothing like the chaos he had unleashed upon it. The man who once claimed he saw evil in the eyes of women was gone, but the evil he inflicted remained, carved into the memories of families who would never again be whole, etched into the files of investigators who had spent their careers chasing shadows, and branded into the collective consciousness of communities that had lived in fear of a faceless killer. His legacy was not one of fascination or twisted genius, as some serial killers are sometimes portrayed, but of raw terror and rage. His was a story of justice delayed, justice nearly denied, and justice that barely managed to hold on long enough to keep him behind bars until his death. And yet when the name Carl Eugene Watts is spoken, it is not just the horror that must be remembered, it is the futures he stole. Behind every victim was a life cut short, a path that could have led somewhere beautiful but was stopped in its tracks by a predator with no mercy. Imagine Gloria Steele, the young woman who let a stranger into her home, thinking she was doing something kind, something human. At only 20 years old, she could have become anything. She might have built a career, raised a family, or traveled the world. Her kindness that night could have been the same kindness she would have given her own children, had she lived long enough to have them. Think of Shirley Small, just 17 when she was stabbed in the heart. She was still on the edge of youth, just beginning to discover who she was. Perhaps she would have gone to college, found her passion in teaching, or pursued a career that would have made her proud. She might have fallen in love, built friendships that lasted a lifetime, or one day told her children about the dreams she had when she was their age. There was Glenda Richmond, the diner manager, known by her community for her warmth and her work ethic. She was 35 when her life ended in a flurry of knife wounds. She might have gone on to own that diner, to pass it down through her family, to sit at its counter in old age and smile at the laughter of grandchildren running between the tables. Instead, she was found bleeding outside her own home. Rebecca Huff was just 20, stabbed more than 50 times in a display of brutality that still horrifies anyone who hears it. She was a young woman with her whole life ahead, 1,000 choices yet to make, 1,000 roads to walk. She might have written books, painted canvases, or started a business. She might have lived quietly, raising children of her own, never famous but always remembered by the people who loved her. She had that chance stolen from her. And what about 63-year-old Lena Bennett? Age had not made her any less vulnerable to a man like Carl Watts. She was a grandmother, perhaps looking forward to years of peace, of rocking chairs on porches, of baking pies for Sunday dinners, of watching her family grow. Instead, her body was found hanging in her own garage, her dignity stripped away by cruelty. Each of these women, and so many others whose names are lost to the shadows of Carl's confessions, could have written entire lifetimes if they had been spared. Now, as disturbing as the crimes of Carl Eugene Watts were, they're only part of the larger story of America's most terrifying killers. To fully understand the scale of cruelty hidden in plain sight, we need to revisit a case we've already covered, but one that still sends chills every time his name is spoken. That man is Samuel Little, a serial killer whose crimes shocked investigators with both their scope and the decades of silence that allowed him to keep killing.
They were human beings in that they were all totally different. They're you.
In September 2014, Little was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms in prison.
It's late at night. While most people go to sleep after a tiring day, others begin their work as the moon indicates the arrival of darkness over the sky. A transgender black woman is relishing in the bar in Miami, Florida. She smiles at a young black man with curly hair and a thick mustache. The man approaches her, and the two hit it off right away. Little does this woman know that this interaction marks the end of her days in this world. What happens next with the woman is truly gut-wrenching. On their second meetup, the man drives the woman to a secluded place, grabs her neck in an attempt to smother her to death, and then leaves her in the middle of nowhere for the body to decompose.
You pick the ones that you think you're going to kill?
No, if you want, it depends on how the neck looks. Got a smooth neck and turn. As a child, I got attracted to
The neck part.
Yeah.
So you pick them out by the way that their neck looks, because if the neck looks good, then there might be somebody that you want to have sex with, or somebody that you might want to kill. What's the thought? Both. Okay.
The most heinous serial killer, Samuel McDowell, also known as Samuel Little, showed no remorse as he proudly described how he murdered his first victim in 1971. And then there was no stopping him from hunting down helpless women who fall under the category of the less dead people. From 1971 to 2005, this man would pursue, kill vulnerable women from one state to another, and get away with at least a haunting number of 93 murders over a period of several decades.
I met her in a nightclub in New Orleans. So I took off the exit, went, and that sure enough was a road leading into the woods. And we went in and I grabbed her by the legs and pulled her to the water. Mm-hmm. That's the only one that I ever killed by drowning.
A pure evil who does not show a hint of remorse through his expressions, Samuel Little was rather proud of his murder confessions. On June 7, 1940, a prostitute gave birth to a child who would ruthlessly kill women from her profession. The most prolific murderer in the history of the USA was born in the small town of Reynolds, Georgia. This town had a population of about 1,000. Most of the town residents lived below the poverty line. Samuel was an unwanted child since the day he arrived in this world. At one point, his mother abandoned him on the side of the road so she could get away with the expenses of raising a child. He saw his mother selling herself at night and called her the Lady of the Night in one of his confessions. Since his early childhood days, Samuel saw how the poorest of people worked to earn money. He had quite a distant relationship with his mother, who would think of him as an additional expense and not a son. But Samuel was not completely abandoned by his family. His grandmother decided to take responsibility for his expenditures and gave him a place in her house in Lorain, Ohio. Samuel attended Hawthorne Junior High School, but quickly dropped out due to poor grades and even poorer behavior. He was, however, good at art and boxing, which came in handy later in life when he viciously took the lives of innocent women. After dropping out of school, he would choose a path that would drive him to commit crimes. Samuel would get addicted to breaking the law, which would land him in prison over 100 times. In 1956, at the young age of 16, Samuel was convicted of breaking and entering. He was sent to a juvenile detention center and released shortly. About 5 years later, he was once again caught breaking and entering a Lorraine furniture store. This time he was sent to an adult prison for some time. Samuel's list of crimes increased as he got older. He was arrested about 26 times in 11 different states by the time he reached 35 years of age. This man had quite a clear vision of what he wanted in life, and it clearly did not involve abiding by the law. Samuel had a long list of crimes that did not involve murder yet: assault, theft, DUIs, fraud, solicitation, armed robbery, breaking and entering, aggravated assault on a police officer, shoplifting, and many more crimes that Samuel would commit throughout his life before finally getting sentenced to life in prison. While he is getting caught, convicted, and released, nobody in law enforcement has realized that this man is killing women from one U.S. state to another. By 1975, he had been across 11 states for almost every crime that you have heard of, and even attacking government officials. And yet, he always managed to walk free. Then came 1982. Little was arrested in Pascagoula, Mississippi, for the murder of 22-year-old Melinda Rose Lepre, who had gone missing that September. It seemed like the law had finally caught up with him, but no. A grand jury refused to indict him, and just like that, he was off the hook. Before investigators could do anything else, Little was shipped off to Florida, where he was tried for the murder of 26-year-old Patricia Ann Mount. Witnesses said they had seen him with Mount the night before she disappeared, but the jury didn't trust their testimonies. Once again, he walked free in January 1984. After that, Little moved to California and wasted no time finding new victims. In October 1984, he kidnapped, beat, and strangled 22-year-old Lori Barros in San Diego. She survived. A month later, police found him in the back seat of his car with another woman, beaten, unconscious, and barely alive. She had been left in the same area where he had attacked Barros. This time, he was sentenced to just 2.5 years in prison, and the moment he got out in February 1987, he went straight to Los Angeles and murdered at least 10 more women. For years, Little moved from place to place, leaving behind a trail of victims while staying just out of reach of the law. All that changed on September 5, 2012. Police found him at a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky, and arrested him on a narcotics charge. It seemed like a small offense, but little did they know, a DNA test will change everything moving forward. The results linked him to 3 cold cases from the 1980s: Linda Alford, killed in July 1987, Guadalupe Duarte Apodaca, killed in September of the same year, and Audrey Nelson Everett, killed in August 2 years later. All 3 had been strangled and dumped on the streets of Los Angeles. That arrest opened the floodgates, and the water came drowning the law enforcement authorities. Investigators soon tied him to more than 30 other murders from the same time period. The case of Melinda Lepre in Mississippi was reopened, and the deeper police dug, the worse it got. Eventually, Little admitted to killing 93 women across multiple states, making him the deadliest serial killer in U.S. history. For years he had gone unnoticed, preying on women society had overlooked. But in the end, his past caught up with him, and this time there was no escaping justice. By September 2014, nearly 2 years later after he was caught on a narcotics charge, Samuel Little was finally on trial for the murders of Linda Alford, Audrey Nelson Everett, and Guadalupe Duarte Apodaca. The prosecution had rock-solid DNA evidence, plus testimony from survivors who had barely escaped his attacks over the years. On September 25, 2014, the verdict came down: Samuel Little was found guilty. Little was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. But even then, he refused to admit what he had done, insisting he was innocent. He was locked up at California State Prison in Los Angeles County. But that was far from the end of his story. For decades, law enforcement suspected that Little had killed far more people than they could prove. Then, in November of 2018, everything changed. Out of nowhere, he confessed to strangling Melissa Thomas in 1996. A few days later, he admitted to killing Denise Christie brothers in 1994. That confession led to another trial in Texas, where he pleaded guilty and picked up another life sentence. But he wasn't done talking. Over the next few weeks, Little started spilling details about dozens of other murders. Investigators were stunned as he confessed to more than 90 killings across 14 states, spanning from 1970 to 2005. He looked in the eyes of the officers as he admitted to these crimes, making fun of the authorities who failed to catch him as he put the vulnerable through extreme suffering before finally taking their lives. His memory was terrifyingly sharp. He could describe victims in detail, recall where he had picked them up, and even explain how he had disposed of their bodies. He admitted to killing of Brenda Alexander in Alabama, Fredonia Smith in Georgia, Dorothy Richards and Daisy McGuire in Louisiana, Julia Critchfield in Mississippi. He had claimed to dump her body off a cliff. Nancy Carol Stevens in Mississippi, Evelyn Weston in South Carolina, Rosie Hill in Florida. And those were just the ones confirmed in November of 2018. Little wasn't just talking, he was drawing. From his prison cell, he sketched portraits of his victims, capturing their faces with haunting accuracy. The FBI released these drawings, hoping to match them to real missing persons and unsolved cases. And it worked. At least one of his sketches helped solve a cold case in Ohio. The confessions kept coming, and they would not stop until the death of this monster. In December 2018, he was indicted for the 1981 murder of Linda Sue Boards in Kentucky. That same month, a Tennessee victim from 1975 was finally identified as Martha Cunningham. Then, in 2019, he was linked to even more killings in Ohio, including Mary Jo Payton and Rose Evans in Cleveland. A woman found near I-271 in Ohio. He couldn't remember her name. A victim in Akron. 2 women in Cincinnati. One was Anna Stewart, last seen visiting her sister in the hospital in 1981. A woman he met in Columbus and dumped in Kentucky. By June 2019, he had been officially indicted for multiple Ohio murders. Little's confessions didn't just close cold cases, they also freed innocent people. In November 2020, he admitted to 2 Florida murders, including one where someone else had been wrongfully convicted. Even after his death in December 2020, his crimes were still being uncovered. In 2022, authorities identified Zena Marie Jones, one of his Memphis victims from the 90s. In the end, Samuel Little confessed to so many murders that were more than any other known serial killer in American history. Many of his victims were women society had ignored: sex workers, runaways, women struggling with addiction. They had been forgotten, their cases left unsolved for decades. But in his final years, Little gave them back their names. He told their stories. And though justice came far too late for most of them, their families finally got the answers they had been waiting for. Here are some of the stories, in his own filthy words, that Little told about the victims he claimed were less dead. Location 1: Miami, Florida. Victim 1: Marianne. Marianne was a young and attractive teenage transgender black woman. According to Samuel Little, she was around 140 pounds and between 5 feet 6 to 5 feet 7 inches tall. In 1971, the two met at a bar called Pool Palace in Miami, Florida. They talked for a while and hit it off immediately. A few days later, they crossed paths again at another bar in Overtown. This time, Little offered Marianne a ride home, and she accepted without hesitation. Upon arriving at her residence, one of Marianne's roommates asked Little to buy shaving cream. Taking advantage of the moment, he lured Marianne back into his car under the pretense of running the errand. Once on Highway 27, he reached over and wrapped his hands around her throat, tightening his grip until she was lifeless.
And drug her into the groups back there and pulled her deeper into there's a path. A little path was running somewhere. I don't know where it led it to, but it was running deeper into the undergrowth. It's like Everglades like that. And we ran into some water running. But before we got to the water, the earth was mushy. I turned her loose, and she fell into it face down.
And how far outside of Miami do you think you were?
About a mile, 2 miles.
What year did Marianne occur?
72.
Okay, 1972.
She was...
Without remorse, he drove to a remote dirt road leading to a river, where he discarded her body into the thick, muddy waters. Then, as if nothing had happened, he returned to his life, unbothered and unnoticed. Victim 2. Unknown woman. Little's second victim in Florida, murdered in 71 or 72, was another black woman. He described her with brutal disdain, calling her ugly, dark-skinned, short and stiff. He believed she worked as a prostitute. After picking her up, he drove to the woods near military property, where he smothered her to death before abandoning her body among the trees, assuming someone would eventually discover it. Victim 3. Emily. In the mid-70s, Little took the life of a young black prostitute, whom he recalls as Emily. He remembered her as having big legs and a pretty face. She carried a University of Miami student ID, reinforcing his belief that she worked as a prostitute. After luring Emily into his car, he drove down a highway toward a secluded dirt road. A fight broke out between them, and Emily fought back, throwing punches at him. Enraged, Little overpowered her, beating her to death before dragging her lifeless body to a garbage pile and concealing it beneath a mattress. He even recalled seeing a man watching from a distance, but, as always, he walked away without consequence. Victim 4. Unknown woman. A 28-year-old black woman, dark-skinned and well-built, crossed paths with Little 2 years after he had known her family. He and his girlfriend, Jean, had sold clothes to them on Nelson Street. When he ran into her at a liquor store, she was complaining about her husband's mistreatment. Seizing the opportunity, Little offered her comfort and a ride. And then, he strangled her and abandoned her body in the thick grass, leaving her to be swallowed by the elements. Victim 5. Unknown woman. In 1977 or 1978, Little met a chubby black woman dancing at a bar. She was wearing shorts that night, but later changed into a skirt at her house before they left together. Her siblings, familiar with Little, called him Sam. After she rejoined him outside, he told her they were going to Lakeland. Instead, he drove toward the dark woods near the railroad tracks, where he strangled her to death. He kept her underwear as a twisted trophy before discarding her body in the open wilderness. Location 2. North Little Rock, Arkansas. Victim 1. Ruth. On a frigid, snowy day in North Little Rock, Arkansas, Little encountered another black woman, approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall, whom he believes was named Ruth. They spent 3 days together before he was arrested for shoplifting. Upon his release 3 hours later, he returned to his car where Ruth was asleep in the passenger seat. They drove around, meeting her ex-boyfriend before eventually heading back to her place. The following day, Little drove Ruth down a dirt road, determined to make her his next victim. He strangled her manually, then abandoned her lifeless body near a cornfield. Location 3. California. Victim 1. Unknown woman. In 1987, in Los Angeles, Little entered a drug dealer's house and spotted a black woman wearing shorts. The dealer, also her pimp, ordered her to leave with Little. After purchasing drugs, they entered an abandoned house with a garage cluttered with wood planks, paint cans, and sawhorses. They climbed onto a ledge inside the garage, but as Little's sick urges consumed him, he wrapped his hands around her throat. The young woman fought desperately, and in their struggle, they fell off the ledge. But Little's grip remained firm. He choked her to death. Weeks later, when he drove by, the crime scene was taped off, and soon after the entire structure was demolished. Victim 2, unknown woman. Later, still in California, Little met another black woman wearing a mini dress at a motel near Tam's Burgers in Los Angeles. He contemptuously called her a crackhead. Exploiting her drug addiction, he lured her into his car. He parked near thick vegetation by a laundromat, where she climbed into the back seat. He followed, wrapped his hands around her throat, and squeezed until she stopped breathing. He later disposed of her body near an iron pipe railing, hanging her lifeless corpse among the thick trees and underbrush, confident that no one would find her. Victim 3, unknown teenage girl. A teenage girl, about 19 years old, became another victim of his monstrosity. She was petite, weighing only 120 pounds, and had a distinctive red bandana around her forehead with tattoos adorning her body. Little met her in Compton, California, and promised her drugs. She trusted him and got into his car. He drove her to the secluded Hollywood Hills, where he suddenly turned violent. The young girl fought for her life with every ounce of her strength, but it was no match for Little's trained fists. When he finally crushed the life out of her, he pulled over by a fence and threw her body down the steep hillside, listening with satisfaction as it tumbled into the darkness. Victim 4, unknown woman. Another victim met her tragic fate at Little's hands in 1992. She was a black woman wearing a religious turban, light-skinned, and weighed about 200 pounds. Little lured her into his car and drove to his residence before heading to Compton. It was raining when he parked behind a store during a riot. The chaos outside masked her final struggle. She honked, desperately trying to summon help. A Hispanic man noticed, but did nothing. Overpowering her, Little smothered her to death. He placed her lifeless body in the passenger seat to make it look as though she were merely sleeping. Then, he drove to a nearby bank branch and pulled her body onto the manicured lawn, leaving her to the mercy of the storm. But despite his staggering body count, he was only officially convicted for 8 murders, cases where DNA and witness testimonies made his guilt undeniable. These victims were just the beginning of Little retelling the tales of his monstrosity. Some names he remembered, while some he had long forgotten. However, he still recalled the eerie details of his victims' weight and height, even remembering their facial features. The list would go on to complete the horrific number of 93. While he admitted to the murders, Samuel Little also began to share the details of his personal life during the years he killed innocent women left and right. Little had a longtime girlfriend, Aurelia Dorsey, who stuck by his side, even helping him evade conviction in a 1972 robbery case. Their relationship wasn't built on love in any conventional sense. It thrived in the shadows of crime, a partnership rooted in deception and survival. But Dorsey, like so many in Little's circle, didn't get a happy ending. She died of a brain hemorrhage in 1988, leaving him to continue his dark work alone. Even in death, Little remained an enigma. On December 30th, 2020, he passed away in a Los Angeles County hospital. Officially, there was no cause of death listed, but given his failing health, diabetes, heart problems, and a body worn down by time, his end was inevitable. Unlike his victims who were discarded like afterthoughts, he slipped away peacefully, a privilege he never granted them. But death didn't grant him an escape from being the infamous monster that he was. His crimes and confessions became the subject of books, interviews, and documentaries. Author Gillian Lauren sat across from him for more than 40 hours, listening as he relived his horrors, sketching the faces of women whose names had long been forgotten. She had started with the intention of writing a crime novel, but her path took a sharp turn when she learned about him from LAPD detective Mitzi Roberts. What began as fiction turned into a brutal, undeniable reality. Lauren's work led to the haunting Stars docuseries Confronting a Serial Killer and her book Behold the Monster, both peeling back the layers of Little's twisted existence. Through her efforts, the world saw not just the killer, but the failures of a system that let him keep killing for over 40 years. His victims weren't just statistics, they were people, ignored because of their race, lifestyle, or circumstances. Society had forgotten them, but Little hadn't. He remembered every detail. In the end, Samuel Little died as he lived, in his own world, his own twisted mind, painting the faces of the women he murdered. He never showed remorse, never feared justice. He saw himself as untouchable, a predator who played by his own rules. But history will remember him differently, not as a mastermind or a legend, but as a killer with no remorse who thrived on society's indifference. And while his body rests in a grave somewhere, his victims still speak, through their families, through investigators, and through the stories now told to ensure that monsters like him don't go unnoticed again. His story is a harrowing reminder of the victims society often overlooks, the ones whose disappearances go unnoticed, whose names fade without justice. The question remains, how many more remain nameless, were lost in the silence of his brutal legacy?